Hey class, in this lab we are going to be going over projectile physics in Godot. So we'll be introducing a couple of new concepts, including using a packed scene that will instantiate into our scene to create projectiles for our player to throw or shoot. And so we'll go over a few different ways to do the physics. In this one, we're also going to be making some art because there isn't a sort of correlating art lab for this one since we're just making one piece of art. So we'll go over that first, then we'll add the projectile into the scene. Then we will write the script for the projectile, and we'll also update the player controller script with some new code to incorporate the projectile. There's a couple bonuses for this lab. One is to add an item which enables the projectile, so not just having the projectile as a default. And then the other is to add a projectile to the enemy in the scene. So you could do one or both of those bonuses if you want to spend a little bit more time exploring how the projectile works. So let's get started. To get started, I'm gonna open up my MMP 270 folder. And if you have a game project that you're working on, as usual, just work in there. If you're working in the developer default folder, you can work in there as well. And for this lab, there isn't a correlating art lab for the projectile because it's just like one thing. So I'm just gonna make that really quick in Pascal. Feel free to, find some art on Open Game Art or some Creative Commons art, or if you want to design your own projectile in Pascal, you can do that, or you can use another program if you want. I'm just gonna do this real quick. I'm gonna open up Pascal. And so I'm just gonna make something really simple. I'm gonna make one sprite sheet that is going to have both of my animations just to keep things super simple. I'm going to have a little fireball that kind of moves just a little bit just so you can see it's moving, and then a short couple frames for when it hits something, it'll disappear. I'm going to start by changing the size. Most of my enemies are 32 by 32 pixels, so I don't want the fireball to be as big as the enemies, so I'm going to change this to 16 by 16 and click resize. And I'm going to start with a color for kind of the middle of the fireball. So I'm going to get some kind of red, slightly pinkish color here. And I'm going to make it pretty bright. So I'm going to choose a pretty saturated color. And I'll just draw like a little ball. And I'm drawing it kind of to the right. I'm going to draw a little tail coming out of it. And so that's pretty good. And so I'm going to choose another color, maybe kind of something kind of orange. So it'll kind of look like fire. And I'm just going to draw a little tail sort of coming off the fireball. So that's pretty good. I think that'll look pretty good. And then let's do one more color, kind of yellow, just to add some little highlights, maybe put a little bit in front, something like that, some streaks. Okay, not anything too crazy, but I think that looks pretty good. And so I'm just going to keep working with that. So I'm going to go to the next frame, just going to keep things kind of simple. I'm going to go back to that pink, draw my circle again. And so I'm just going to kind of draw this a little bit differently this time. So I'll draw the tail coming down like this a little bit. And that looks pretty good. I kind of lost a bit of the pink, so let's bring some pink back, put some orange back in there, maybe put some pink here. And then let's do some highlights with the yellow again. I'm going to turn onion skin off actually, so it's easier to see the colors. Okay, that looks pretty good. Doesn't really have to be that perfect, so I'm going to go to the next frame. I'm just going to do 3 frames on this animation. So I'm doing a fireball. You could do lots of other different types of things, lasers, whatever it is that you want to draw to add to your scene. And so I'm going to do the pink circle again, and then I'm going to do another kind of orange tail coming out. Okay, that looks pretty good. And then some more yellow highlights. Okay, that looks good enough. Doesn't have to be perfect. So I'm going to put 2 animations into the same frame here. I'm going to go to the next frame. And for this one, I'm just going to have the fireball this is going to be like what happens when we actually hit something. So we'll start with like the pink circle as usual, but then we'll just have some like dots on the outside for the yellow and the orange. So that'll be kind of when it hits. And then we'll have one more frame. And in this frame, there'll be a couple pink dots and some orange dots. Oops. And some yellow dots. So nothing too crazy here. it's just going to look really simple, and that'll be it. Then the fireball will be gone. So we just want some art here. Obviously, you should spend more time on this to implement whatever it is that you want to make with your design. But this is a programming lab, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the art. So I'm going to save this as my projectile and click Save As. So if I want to come edit this later, I can do that. I guess this is kind of like art, so maybe I'll leave it in my artist folder. So I'll just call this projectiles. And I just have this one. If I want to call it fireball, that's fine. Whatever you want to call it. But what I really need is just to export my sprite sheet. So I'm going to go to export, and I'm going to keep everything the same here and just click download. And this I'm going to put into my project folder. So I'm going to go to MMP 270, go to developer, and go to developer default, and then go to sprites. And so I'll just save this in here, and so I'll be able to use that in my lab. So I'm going to make one other sprite while I'm here, which is a target. So in the second part of the lab, we'll be adding mouse input for the direction of the projectile. So in order for that to work well, the player should be able to see where they're aiming. So I'm just going to put a little target here. So I'm going to call this target, and actually let's make sure to save this. And I'll just put it in the projectiles as well. And I'm just going to make something really, really simple here. So let's start by adding a grid so we can see what we're doing. So I'm going to draw some straight lines. Actually want this to be black. Okay, and so we'll get kind of our target like this. Okay, actually I want to have black and white so that the target will stand out no matter where we're looking at. So I'm actually going to change this to white really quickly. There we go. And then I'm going to draw around that in black. Oops. So there's a lot of different ways that you could do this. I'm just doing something pretty simple and pretty straightforward. But you might want to hand draw something. Since this is part of the UI, I want to make it a little bit more kind of like standardized. And this is really simple, but you could draw lots of different stuff here. But essentially, this is just going to replace the mouse cursor so that people can see what they're looking at. But again, this is a programming lab, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on here. So I'm just going to export this, and there's just one frame. So export sprite sheet is fine. And this will be target.png. Now we have the art that we need to complete the lab. And so let's leave Pascal. So I'm going to go into my developer default and open up project.godot, and we can get started. And so we're going to introduce a new concept in this lab, which is the packed scene. And so this is a scene, unlike our other components of our scene that are there when we start the scene, this isn't going to be in the scene to begin with. So we're just going to create a new scene, but then we're going to instantiate instances of that scene in the game. So I'll go over how we're going to do that. But first, we're just going to go to scenes and go to add a new scene. So we'll say create new scene, and we're going to call this projectile and hit OK. And you could call it like fireball, or, you know, if you're making something with like lasers, or maybe it's like a bow and arrow, or maybe you're just throwing rocks, whatever the projectile is, you can name it that if you want. I'm just going to name it projectile, so it's kind of generic. We know what it is. And for my root node, I'm going to choose an area 2D. And so this is a collision object that will kind of let us know when it's run into other things. So that's what we want to use. So we'll call this area 2D, and I'm going to rename this node projectile and save that scene. So when you save it, you'll see it in the scenes area. So we want to make sure that it's saved. You can see a warning. That's because we have a collision object that doesn't have a collider. So let's go ahead and add that now. We can add a collision shape 2D. And I'm going to click create, and then we have another warning because we haven't chosen a shape. And so you're going to want to choose a shape that matches your artwork. My fireball is kind of a circle, so I'm just going to go ahead and choose a circle shape. But if you have like a long, arrow or laser or something like that, you can use a rectangle, maybe a capsule, whatever it is that matches your art the best. So we're going to build this one from scratch. So I'm going to add in an animated sprite. Again, this is a programming lab, so I'm just going to try to go through this quickly. I'm going to put the animated sprite beneath the collision shape so that we can match the art. And let's make our animation real quick. So I'm going to click on frames in the animated sprite, new frames, click the sprite frames. I'm going to delete this default animation. Our animation for the projectile is going to have two states. It's going to have flying, or I'll just call it fly, and it will have hit. So when it hits an obstacle or something else in the scene. And so let's just make those animations real quick. I'm going to add some animation frames by clicking that little waffle and go to sprites and look for our fireball. All of our frames for both of our animations in here. And so it's really small. I'm going to choose 2 horizontal, 3 vertical, and then click on these little frames. It's kind of hard to see here, but now we have our animation. Let's turn on playing. And so that looks pretty good. You can just see that something's moving, and we want to make sure that our collision shape is not bigger than our art. Let's make sure our animated sprite is kind of more centered here. And then let's move our collision shape on top. So we definitely want the collision shape to be inside the art so it doesn't look like the enemy is getting hit if the art is actually passing through them. Let's go back to our animated sprite, and it looks like I accidentally did this under hit. This is actually supposed to be fly. So let's rename fly to hits and make sure fly is just called fly. But this one is just going to be playing by default, so we don't actually have to reference this in the code. So then for the hit animation, click the waffle again. We already have the fireball chosen, and now we're just going to choose the last 2 frames. And so that animation will just play when it hits something. I don't want this one to loop, and I want it to go maybe a little bit slower, so I'll do like 3 FPS. And so it's just 2 quick frames, just so it doesn't look like the fireball just disappears in nowhere. There's a couple more things that I need to set up. So one thing is that I want to make sure that my fireballs are on their own layer so that they don't interact with things that I don't want them to interact. You probably remember talking about collisions in the last 2 labs. And so we're going to be changing the collision layer and mask. We actually probably don't have a layer for this one, so let's make one. So I'm going to go to project settings, and then scroll down to layer names, and then 2D physics. We're going to make sure layer 10 is the projectile, and we're going to be comparing the projectile against the obstacle hit, which is where we can kill the enemy. And then at the end, we'll also look at how to make it hit the platform. So I'm going to add both of those in now. You don't actually have to necessarily include support for that, but I'm just going to do it now while we're here. So I'll choose the, we have to actually refresh this to get those labels back. There we go. So I'm going to choose the projectile as the layer, and I'm going to turn off, it's not on the player layer. And then the mask, it's going to be looking for not the player, but the platform and the obstacle hit. So remember, the obstacle hit is where the player can jump on the enemies. And for our projectiles, they're going to basically do the same thing. If our projectile hits the vulnerable area of the snake obstacle that we have, then that's going to kill the snake. So that's good for our layers and masks. Let's save that. And while we're working on the layers and masks, let's open up our obstacle moving and take a look at how this is going to work. So we have this hit area, which is, whoops, it's locked up. So let's lock up this guy. And now hopefully we can look at our hit area. So this is kind of near the snake's head, and that's where the player has to jump to hit the snake. But now we're also going to be able to hit that with our projectile. So we want to make sure that our hit area includes the projectile in the mask. So it shouldn't actually have obstacle hit. I don't know why that's there. But let's add the projectile to the mask, and then its layer is obstacle hit, so that's correct. And so that way we know that the projectile can interact with that area, and that area can interact with the projectile. So there's one more thing that we have to do before we go to write our code. We are going to be shooting these projectiles into the scene, and they can sort of go off the side of the scene if they don't run into anything. And we don't want to have just like lots of floating projectiles going on infinitely. So one thing that we can do is use what's called a visibility notifier. And this is something that Godot provides that will essentially say if the object is no longer visible in the Godot window, it's just going to remove the object. So we'll use that. So we're going to go to add child node and type in visibility. And you can see visibility notifier 2D. So we're just going to create that. And we can make sure that this area that it gives us actually fits the art. So if this is like really large, that's good. We definitely will know that this is off the screen before it gets removed. If we want the performance to be a little better, we can kind of bring it in here, but we don't want it to be any smaller than the art, because then we'll see sort of like some clipping happen if it's removed from the scene before the art is completely gone. Okay, and then the one last thing that we need to add in here actually is our sound. Of course, we have a sound for this like we do with anything else. So let's add an audio stream player. And what we'll do is just have this sound play as soon as the fireball kind of enters the scene. And so that sound effect will be associated with the fireball. So we can call this SFX. It doesn't really matter what it's called. And we don't even actually have to put this in our code because we're just going to set it to autoplay. So I'll click on the SFX, go to the stream, go to load, and we have a projectile sound from our sound effects lab. So we can throw that in there. And I'm just going to set it on autoplay. And then I'm just going to make sure that it's not set to loop. So I'm going to go to projectile.wave, go to import. I can see that loop is not set to on, so that's good to go. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Let's set up our script, and we're also going to have to modify the PlayerController script. So let's click on our projectile and get started with the basics here first. We may have to kind of move back and forth between our projectile and our player script. So I'm just going to click on the script empty and click new script and make sure this is in the scripts folder. So I'm going to go back and go to scripts, and projectile.gd is good for the script name, template empty. So that's everything that I want here. So that looks good. Let's get rid of some of our other scripts. So I'm just going to close these scripts that we're not working on and just leave our player and our projectile scripts. So we just have our player controller, which we're going to have to edit, and our projectile. So extends area 2D is what we want to start. And then we're going to add a few variables here. So we're going to add a speed. So I'm just going to say variable speed, and let's set that to, let's say 400. We can adjust this later depending on what we want the projectile to look like. And I'm not going to make this an export variable because this is not actually going to be in our scene. So there's no real reason to have it as an export variable. We're not going to be able to set those values in the editor. So we'll have to come back and change this if we don't like the speed of the projectile. The next thing I'm going to do is add a velocity. So I'm going to say variable velocity, and this is going to be a vector 2. So in the first part of this demo, we're only going to be using the X value of this one, but we will be using X and Y later. And it makes sense to just call this velocity. So I'm just going to leave that as it is. And then I'm going to add a variable to track whether or not it should be flying through the air. Because if it hits something, we are going to have a couple frames of animation, but it shouldn't continue moving. And so we're going to say is flying, and we're going to set that equal to true. So that's sort of like the is alive component of our player script or our obstacle scripts. But for this particular object, it's not really alive or dead. It's just whether or not it's flying through the air or not. So the next thing that we need in our script is our physics process. So we're going to do func_physics, and Godot's filling in the rest for me. So I'm going to say physics process, and we get that delta, that change in time since the last physics update. And so we're just going to update this to move our projectile across the screen. And so we're going to make sure first that it's still flying or, alive. So we'll say if is flying. And then we're going to change the position based on the velocity and the delta. So we're going to say position plus equals velocity times delta. And we're going to be updating this a little bit as we go through, but this is basically essentially saying take whatever our velocity is and multiply it by the change in time and then update the position. So that's pretty simple to get started. One more thing I'm going to add in here is a little check to say if it's not visible on the screen, then we need to remove it. So I'm going to say if not, and then the way that we do this is using our $sign to get a reference to our visibility notifier. So if I type in V, it gives us that visibility notifier, which is a node inside of our object. That has a method that's just is on screen. And that basically does what it sounds like. It tells us whether or not the node, based on the area that we define with the visibility notifier, is on the Godot window. And if it's not, we're just going to remove it from the scene. So we're going to use queue_free. Remember, that just removes the object from the scene. So that's pretty straightforward. Now we're going to make some modifications to the player controller to allow the player to shoot the projectiles. Then later we'll come back here to finish the rest of the functionality of the projectile. So the first thing I want to do is actually open a scene that has my player in it. So I'm going to go to scenes and go to default scene. And let's go back to the scene node. And there's no enemies in here. Let's see if I have a scene that already has enemies in it. No, I don't. So let's add some obstacles, some moving obstacles. So I should have some of these from the previous lab. So I'm going to add one in here. Whoops. Let's lock down the player. And so I have a moving obstacle over here. So let's put him down here. And let's make a couple more of these and add them to these other platforms just so we have something to shoot our projectiles at. And actually, let's just delete this one and add in another snake to put down here. Those should all start moving around and then our player will be able to shoot them. So let's remove these other obstacles as well, just to make this a little simpler. So that should be enough to get started. So then I'm going to select my player and we're going to add in a new script variable that allows the player to get a reference to the projectile. So I'm going to click on the PlayerController script. And after our first set of export variables, I'm going to add a couple new variables. So one will be another export variable. So we're going to say export var, and I have to give this a little hint so that Godot will know how to add this in. So I'm going to call this packed scene, and we're going to call this projectile. And we're also going to add another little script that's going to help us with some of the animation. So this is a little bit like our isAlive value. I probably should have been using this in the past, but I'm just going to call this isMoving. And I'm going to set this to true, but when our player actually throws our projectile or shoots our projectile, whatever you want to call it, we need something to prevent the other animations from happening. So I'm just going to add in a isMoving value, kind of tacking this on in this example just because I didn't have something to do this before. So this isn't necessarily the best way to do it, but that's how we're going to do it here. Now let's go back to our player node and we can see the projectile has been added here. I'm going to click on the empty and click load and then find my projectile scene. So that's right here. I'm going to click open. So now the player has a reference to this projectile, and when we play the game, we can add the projectile into the scene. So let's go back to our player script, and we're going to go to our player update, and we're going to capture some more input. So we also actually have to add in a couple ways to capture the input for the projectile. We need to do that as well. Go to project settings and go back to our input map. And let's collapse some of these. So we have our moving buttons and we have our jumping button. And so let's add in a new one for shooting a projectile. So shooting a fireball. So I'm just going to call this shoot and click add. And then let's add a key. I use X for jump. So let's use Z for shoot. And we can also add in a mouse button. So I'm going to just use the default device with the left button and just click add. So I can actually detect both of those types of input, the keyboard or the mouse, with the same input. Now I'm going to say shoot projectile. And so we'll say if input dot is action, and we're going to use just pressed here like we do for the jump, because we don't want them to be able to just shoot a huge stream of fireballs. They should at least have to click once. So we're going to choose shoot here and hit enter. And so if they do shoot a fireball, we're going to play the shoot animation. So we're going to say animated sprite.play, and then we're going to call this shoot. And I made an animation for that. I'm actually not sure that I have it in my player. So let's go check. So I'm going to go to the player scene, go to the animated sprite. And let's see, I have dies, hit, idle, jump, walk. I don't have the shoot animation, so let's add that in real quick now. So there's a lot of different components to this. I'm gonna go to the waffle, and I'm pretty sure I made this before. So I have attack. That's what we'll use for this. And so that's just 3 frames, 2 horizontal, 2 vertical. And so let's grab that. And we don't want this one to loop. So let's go back to our script. So we want that animation to play, and then I'm gonna set is moving equals false. And I could put something here like is attacking or is throwing or something like that. But really what I want to say here is that we don't want to play the player jumping or walking animations. for the duration of the time that we're shooting. So there may be other things that we would do. So then I'm gonna call a shoot function. I could write all this code right here, but there might be other circumstances where I would wanna shoot something. So I'm just gonna put shoot here, and we're gonna find a new function that does the actual shooting part. So I'm gonna save this. And so now let's scroll down a bit to our animation update. And so what we're gonna do here is essentially just add in the is moving. We don't wanna jump if we're not on floor and is moving. Okay, so we're just gonna add this in here. It's kind of a quick fix. There's probably better ways to do this, but I'm gonna change this one to an elif is moving. And so that way we can play our entire shoot animation without playing one of the other animations on top of it. I think that should kind of take care of that. And then of course, we do want to go back to those animations eventually. So in this animated sprite animation finish, we're just going to check, just like we do with this hit animation, we're going to check if animated sprite.animation equals shoot. Then we'll set is moving back to true so the player can start moving again. So that takes care of the animations. Now let's add the real shooting function. So let's say func shoot. And this is what's going to instantiate our projectile. So let's clear this here. And I'm just going to make some space so we can see this. So in our shoot function, we're going to create an instance of our projectile that we have our export variable for. So I'm going to make a new projectile. I'm just going to call this variable p for projectile gets projectile. So that's a reference to the scene, and then we're going to call dot instance. So this makes an instance of the scene, sort of like how we can make multiple enemies or multiple scenery or different things like that. So now we have created the projectile. We want to set the position of the projectile to match the player, so it looks like it's coming from the player. And you could set it up so it looks like it's coming from a specific part of the player. I'm just going to put it directly in the middle of the player. I'm not too worried about this looking super realistic. So I'm going to say p.position equals self.position. And so self here refers to the player because we're in the player controller. And so we're going to set the projectile position to the current player position, because otherwise if we just made an instance, it would be at 0, 0 at the origin of the scene. And so that would look kind of strange. And so finally, we need to add this projectile into the actual Godot scene. We don't want to add it to the player because we want it to exist on its own and interact with other things in the scene. So I'm going to say owner, which is a little Godot thing that refers to the owner or the scene that the player is in. And I'm going to say add child, and then we're going to add our projectile, which is P. And so it's essentially adding it into the scene like we would if we were to go to default scene and click the instance child scene. Essentially what this is doing that, but while the game is actually being played. So let's test that because I think that should get us started. So I'm going to go back to the default scene and click play. And then I'm going to hit the projectile button. And there we go. We've got a nice little projectile. So it's not moving anywhere. So we have to do something about that. But we can add the projectile and we can hear the sound. And that's pretty cool. So let's actually add in directionality. And so let's go back to our player controller script. And so we have to give the projectile a direction and a velocity, right? So if we add in our velocity, so remember we have our p.velocity, and the speed of the projectile is based on the velocity. So if I said p.velocity.x equals 1, it should start moving. So let's see. It's going very, very slowly. So let's set the velocity to 400, which is the speed, or actually let's just say p.speed because we do have that speed value. Okay, so now the projectile is actually working, but notice it always goes in one direction. So we're gonna make a more sophisticated version of this in a second, but just for now, we can find the direction of the player and then use that to set the direction of our velocity. So let's multiply this speed times, we know the direction of the player because we know what the flip h value is, right? So even if the player is not moving, the sprite will still be either flipped or not. And if the sprite is flipped, it'll be going to the left. And if it's not flipped, it'll be going to the right. So we can use a fancy little line of code here where we can say, -1 if animated sprite.flipH, else 1. Okay, so what this is basically saying is if animated sprite.flipH is true, which means that the sprite is flipped to the left, then we'll give the speed -1. And if it's not, we'll just stick with 1, which won't change the speed at all. So I think this will work. Let's give this a try. So we can go shoot over here and then shoot this way. So that looks pretty good, but you can see that the artwork is actually backwards. It's hard to see because it's kind of small, but if I shoot that way, the tail is kind of behind it, whereas if I shoot that way, the tail is kind of in front of it. There's actually a really easy way to fix that. So let's go back to our script. And so essentially what we want to do is just rotate our projectile in the direction of the velocity. I should probably do this inside the projectile itself, but since we're here, I'm just going to say p.rotation equals p.velocity.angle. And this is actually super, super simple, but it will hopefully rotate our projectile for us. And yeah, now we can see that it's going in the direction we're shooting it. So the projectile doesn't actually hit the snakes because we haven't set that up yet, but at least we can shoot them. And so let's go back to our projectile code and set it up to actually hit our snake. So we're gonna have to add a couple of events for this. So we're gonna go back to our projectile area, go to our node area, and then we're gonna actually do area entered for this one. So this is a little bit tricky, but remember that the area that we're concerned about is this hit area on the snake. It's not the kinematic body of the snake or anything else. So what we're actually looking for is a collision between two areas. So we're gonna go to area entered, and we're gonna click on that, and we're gonna go to just connect. And so here we know that this is gonna be the snake because we have the layer and mask set up that no other area is gonna be detected here. And so what we can do is call that actually has its own hit function. If we go to the obstacle moving, remember that it has its own hit function. So we can go back to our projectile and we can just call that. The thing is that the area itself is a child of the obstacle. So what we're gonna do is say area.getParent. And so remember in our obstacle moving, this is the area that we're getting, but the script that we actually wanna call is on the obstacle moving up here. So we can use getParent to get the parent of this hit, which is the obstacle moving script. So it's a little confusing. You know, in some cases you may have it set up different ways, but the way that we have it set up here, this is how we're gonna do it. And so we're just gonna call the hit function, and then we'll say is flying equals false. So we'll stop updating our projectile, and then we're also gonna play our hit sprite. So we'll say animated sprite dot play and then hit. And then one last thing that we wanna do is remove our object from the scene. We don't want it to just be sitting there, but we do want to wait until after the sprite has finished playing. So we're going to add another node for that. We're going to go to the animated sprite, just like we've done with our player and our obstacles. We're going to add the animation finished event, and we're going to connect that into our script. And here is where we'll do our cue free. So we're just going to say if not is flying. And so we want to add that so it doesn't just remove the object every time it plays an animation. So if it's not flying anymore, we know that it just hit something, and so it needs to be removed. So if not is flying, then we'll call our cue free again. And so that will remove it from the scene. So that actually should be what we need. So let's go back to our default scene and hit play, and hopefully this will work. Let's see if we can get a snake. Oops, it's kind of hard to aim from here. Okay, let me go down here and see if I have a better aim. Okay, that worked. We did get an error, null instance. Oops, I spelled animated sprite wrong. So let's go back here. Okay, so that worked. We actually killed the snake. And we have to be pretty level with the snake. So the spacing is actually pretty good for this. I didn't really do that on purpose. I think that just kind of like worked out, but you may have to play around with the spacing of the projectile, where it comes from and how it actually hits the snake, depending on where those objects collide. So you could change the position in your player controller script. Like you could say p.position is self.position, but if you needed to move it up or down a little bit, you could just say p.position.y plus equals 10 or something like that. if it's not really, level with where you're shooting. I just got kind of lucky there that actually worked out pretty good. If you like this and you just want the projectile to just shoot out into space, you can just stop here. This could be good enough for what you want to do. If you want to add some directionality using the mouse, that's what we're going to cover in the video going forward. We're going to leave most of this the same, but I'm just going to comment out these 2 lines because we don't really need these anymore. We're going to do everything else over in the projectile script. So let's go back to the projectile script and we'll set up a couple things. One thing is that we do want to see where the mouse is. So let's go to our project settings, and under general, this is where we're going to add our mouse target. So we're going to scroll back up to display and go to mouse cursor. And here we're just going to add in our target image. So let's go to sprites, and there's our target. You'll see now when I play the screen, now we can see our mouse. And so that makes a lot more sense in terms of what we're going to be aiming at, so we know where we're actually aiming. Now let's go back to our projectile. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to change this a little bit so that it's flying in the direction of our mouse position. So we just have to add a couple things here. So I'm going to add in a ready function. So this is going to be called as soon as the fireball or projectile is instantiated. And here we're going to set our velocity. So instead of setting it in the player to 1 or -1, we're going to get the position of the mouse. So we're going to say velocity. So we want to know where the mouse is. So we can just say get and then local mouse position. So that's a Godot function that's going to tell us where the mouse is. And so if we look at the Godot documentation, we can see get local mouse position returns the mouse position relative to the item's position. So we set the projectile position to the player position, and then we get the relative mouse position. So basically what that is saying is, let's say our mouse is right here and our projectile is here. So we're going to essentially get the position as a vector. So let's say this is like, 200 on X and this is like 100 on Y. We're going to set the velocity equal to 200 by 100. And we don't want that to be our actual velocity, but that gives us the direction that we want to go in. And then we're going to have to make it a little bit smaller, because if that was our velocity, it would just take the projectile 1 frame to get there, which would not look very realistic. But that gives us the direction. And then we can basically just take this direction vector and make it a little smaller, and then the projectile will travel over the course of time. So that's what we're going to set up. So we have our velocity is our local mouse position, and then we're going to use a cool function called normalized. And essentially what that does is it takes that direction and it normalizes it into a 0 to 1 scale. So for example, if that's our velocity that we're dealing with, 200 by 100, what it's going to do is it's basically going to say, okay, if X was 1, right, then Y would be 0.5. So it's basically taking the larger value and reducing that, and then taking the ratio of the second value or the Y value. And if the Y value is bigger, then the Y value would be 1. But it's essentially taking the overall direction, but reducing it to a smaller value. So it just is a representation of the basic direction rather than the distance of the vector. So might be a little bit confusing, but it's a really useful function for doing lots of stuff in math, like physics and different things like that. So now that we have our velocity as directional representation of where we want to go, we can also add in our speed, since we were using that in our PlayerController earlier. So now we have the velocity, which is set to this direction here, times the delta, the change in time, times the speed that we want our projectile. So let's give that a try. So now we can see our projectile going towards our target. So that's pretty cool. We also need to set our rotation. So let's set that here. We can say rotation equals velocity dot angle, just like we did previously. And this is going to continue to work pretty well for our graphics. You can see that the tail of the fireball is always going in the right direction. So that looks pretty good. Let's see if we can get the snake. So that looks pretty good. So there's a couple other options here. So again, a lot of the stuff is kind of, you can either do it or not. You don't necessarily have to do it. Let's look at a couple of other options for things that we can do. So one thing that you might want to do right now, the fireballs are just going basically in a straight line. If you want it to look a little more realistic, you might want to add gravity into the equation. Since it's an area 2D, it actually has gravity built into it already. So what we can do is just say velocity dot y plus equals gravity times delta. And so this will essentially update our velocity to include gravity. So now you'll see, instead of going in a straight line, and clearly there's way too much gravity. So let's reduce that a little bit. There's probably more sophisticated ways to do this, but I'm just going to divide it by the speed. So we're multiplying the velocity by the speed. I'm going to just divide the gravity by the speed. So it's just a constant number. And so hopefully that works pretty good. And yeah, you can see there's a little bit of an arc to the projectile now. If you wanted to have a different gravity value, like if we change this to like 200 or something like that, then maybe we'd see it fall. So you can kind of decide what you think the best look would be. So if there's more gravity, there's going to be more of an arc. If there's less gravity, there's going to be less of an arc. So I'm just going to leave this speed here. So it's kind of a subtle effect, but it does make it look slightly more realistic. So one last thing that I want to do, you can see when I'm shooting my fireballs, they go straight through the platform. So you might like that and you can keep that the way it is, or you might not think it's super realistic. So if we want the projectile to run into the platforms, then we need to account for what to do when that happens. So we already set up our projectile mask to include the platform layer. So what we can do is just look for when the tile map body enters the projectile area. So we have the area entered for the obstacles, but we can use the body entered to find our tile map. So I'm going to add in another event here. So on projectile body entered. And so we basically just want the projectile to hit the tile map. So we can just say is flying equals false. So kind of the same thing when we hit an enemy, except there's no enemy to get hit. And then we can play our hit animation. And so now if we make this change, if I go back to the default scene, now we can see our projectiles can't pass through the tile maps. So you may want to use that, you may not. You could have different tile maps that it can pass through or not pass through, but we just want to show that as a possibility. Looking at it now, there's no sound that gets played when that happens. So let's just play our sound here. We do have the SFX, so we might as well play it. So I'll just say SFX.play, because normally we're hearing, when we hit the snake, we hear the sound of the snake getting hit, but we don't have a sound here. So we can just add in the SFX if we want to have that. So let's play the default scene. So you might want to add in a different sound effect for that, but that's how you would do it if you want to do it. All right, so that was a lot, but that's everything that I wanted to cover with the projectiles. So hopefully that gives you a lot of options as far as how you want your projectiles to look and how they behave in the scene. So let's do a little bit of documentation. So I'm just gonna play the scene. Let's see, I'll just throw some projectiles and try to make a screenshot. It's kind of hard. I'm just gonna do a full screenshot and then update it. Trying to hit this snake, but I'm actually missing. Okay, so I got a bunch of full screen shots, so I'm just gonna edit those so we just see the window and use that in my OpenLab post. So I'm gonna leave here. Let's save this and let's quit Godot. All right, so I've got a whole bunch of screenshots. I'm just gonna choose one. All right, so I'll just use that one. That's good enough. I'm gonna delete the rest of these and I'm just gonna quickly crop this. So it's easy to do on Mac. I'm sure it's easy to do on Windows as well. I'm just gonna go into preview and select the area that I want and click crop. This is a good one to also make a video for, but however you want to document is going to be fine. So let's go to the OpenLab. I'm going to create a new post. And so I want to add my category. So I'm going to go to Projectile Physics and I'll give a title projectiles. I'll call mine fireball, and I'll say I added in a fireball to throw at, or I guess I'm kind of, the animation I'm kind of throwing, so I'll just leave throw at the snakes. And let's drag in our image. I have to hit enter first. And so we can get a pretty good idea of what that looks like. So let's do a preview. And I think you can even see just like a little bit of the arc from the velocity. So that looks pretty cool. And so I think that looks good. And so I'm gonna go ahead and publish.